not so bad. So when you're seeing an idea that maybe for the first glance frightens you a little bit, give it a little time. Some very talented people have thought these ideas through and are trying to bring good ideas forward. So really, accept that fear a little bit and understand that a master plan built on logic, and this will reduce those elements of fear. I really believe it. I've seen it many times. So we've done all those things. We've come a real long way. And then finally, we want an educationally valid solution here. So when we look at 6 months, it seems like only a blink of the eye, but we created a team of this group months ago, and we've gone through all of those steps from planning to visioning. We've existing building analysis. We've now developed the master plan, and we're trying to put money and dollars to it. So I welcome your attention for the next little bit. I hand it off to a good friend of mine, Sam Johnson from BLDD Architects. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Can I have that pointer? Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you, Frank. Great job. Tonight's where we present a draft master educational facilities plan, a process of envisioning a better educational future for the St. Joseph community. Can I see by show of hands who's here for the first time tonight by any chance? Okay. I'm going to do a brief recap, but it'll be relatively brief because we want to focus the majority of our time on presenting the plan and explaining the ideas that helped create it. The agenda that we'll talk about, as you've heard in the past, master planning process is sort of two big efforts: analysis and synthesis. The synthesis is the part that we're in right now. The analysis has been complete. That was complete at our last meeting where we evaluate the existing buildings and understand the lay of the land. What are the issues that need to be addressed in any plan moving forward? Tonight's the first meeting of synthesis. It's a process of invention. It's an iterative process where we brainstorm possible scenarios, we compare and contrast the scenarios, their strengths and weaknesses, we adjust them accordingly, and then we start the process all over again. Brainstorm, so it's iteration and reiteration. The analysis, I want to do a brief recap of what the analysis showed. There were multiple paths of analysis. You'll recall that there were 54 meetings in 27 facilities, and the community was involved in determining what are the strengths and weaknesses of our existing facilities. There were a number of issues that bubbled up through that process, and they are things that we heard repeatedly. We've categorized them we've collected them. At your last meeting, you ranked them. So these are the issues which we call from this point forward planning principles. These are issues that any master plan must address moving forward. And so they are in priority order: safety and security, site issues, environmental issues, adequate and appropriate spaces for special education programs, spaces for preschool programming, accommodations for students, staff, and citizens with the Americans with Disabilities Act, size and functionality of classrooms and multipurpose spaces. In priority order, those were the most important issues to you. I'm not going to read all of these. These were still important, but they weren't quite as important as those that were listed in the previous slide. So that was one avenue of assessment. The next was that the community, you folks who participated, and teams of professionals who went through the buildings collaboratively scored these buildings. How do they rate as educational facilities? And you gave them a grade out of 100%. The scale is a little different than the scale that you get as a student, where that scale is typically something like anything below 65 fails. This scale, anything below 50 fails. So what I want to do is take just a moment to let you know what the various categories mean. If a building scored, and by the way, none did, if a building scored between 1 and 29, it's very inadequate. Essentially, condemn that building, bulldoze it, get out of it. If a school scored between 30 and 49, and we did have some in the poor category, that meant that they really don't meet most of your needs today as educational facilities, and that they're going to be even more challenged to meet tomorrow's needs. If a facility scored between 50 and 69, they were considered borderline, which means they meet some of the needs for today, not all of them, and they're going to be challenged meeting the needs for tomorrow. So you will definitely want to consider some alternative action, whether it's remodeling, whether it's retiring. You're going to want to consider something. Satisfactory is something that scores between 70 and 89. Now, I know 70 sounds low, but believe me, in this scoring, 70 to 89, means that building meets today's needs and probably most of the needs of the future. There may be, down the road, some remodeling is required, but pretty much it's a suitable facility for today and most of the future's needs. And then if it's something is excellent, between 90 and 100, you're good for the next couple generations, essentially. Just a note, when we did look at modeling scores for new buildings, we never showed anything higher than 95. From my perspective, there's really no perfect school because there's a lot of factors that go into that, meaning location. You know, the perfect center of the population might be in a cemetery, so you may not be able to move, you know. So we just never think of schools being able to score 100. So here is a recap. This is how your elementary facilities scored across the board. The red line indicates borderline. So you see that there were 5 facilities that fell below the borderline at the elementary level. We have also added a new line. You haven't seen this before. It's the green line. That's the average of where your district facilities score. All of your core educational programs score at about a 58. So you can see where each facility compares to the average of the district. This is the middle schools, and you can see there is one that scores below borderline. And again, there's the average of all of the buildings in the district. And the reason I'm showing this to you is because in the subsequent, when I present the draft plan for your consideration, we're going to show how the average changes with each step. And at the high school level, again, one fell below borderline, there's your average. The analysis were completed last week with cost analysis, and I'm not going to go through these in any detail other than to say we performed 4 different cost analysis on a square foot basis that allowed us an apples-to-apples comparison. That was the costs of what the community recommended for changes. The triage and 10 costs, I want to explain this for a second. Triage and 10 are the capital improvements plans developed by professionals for the school district as they move forward. What are the needs of each facility for the next 10 years? So that's what those costs represent. Combined costs were the cost to bring each school to a standard. Combine those costs with the triage and 10 as well as the community recommended costs. And then life cycle costs. Let's project them out 30 years and see how they compare. The bottom sets of comparisons were cost-benefit comparisons, an attempt to put a value on the various scopes of work. Look at the educational adequacy and compare that to the comparative costs. They're a measure of value. So I want to talk briefly about how the draft plan, we're actually presenting 2 different scenarios tonight, but how the draft plan evolved. Right after our meeting, the very next day, I think our meeting was March 29th, on March 30th, Franklin Hill, our firm, members of the local architects who had been presenting worked, and occasionally we met with the school district to get information and advice, guidance, and we started to brainstorm about how to move forward. Franklin set the tone by talking about educational excellence. That first slide that Franklin had was compelling to us. He made the point that anything that we do needs to provide, as its core, the driver needs to provide educational excellence. It needs to do it effectively and provide efficiency, educational efficiency. So we decided to adopt that as our goal for the planning process. Once we got through the visioning process, we asked ourselves, what are the facility implications? What does this look like? Franklin talked about things like proper sizing of capacities of schools for small learning communities and proper student-teacher ratios. So at the elementary levels, we remeasured every classroom, elementary and grade school, and determined new capacities for those schools that would allow us to hold the proper programs. I'll show you how that how that comes into the master plan in a few moments. At the high school levels, we interviewed the principals to understand the planning work that their staffs have been developing so that we can develop an understanding of the changes needed to estimate the costs to implement a change for those programs. So after doing that, it was time to brainstorm. This is the fun part. This is why we all get up in the morning to envision possible scenarios. What you can see here is Sarah from River Bluff Architects, the lady on the right,